Good afternoon and welcome to our final session today. My name is Danny and I'm with the learning team at Cherry Bekaert. Just want to go over a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. For audio during today's webinar, you may listen through the phone or the computer speakers. You can choose your audio under the audio tab in the menu to the right of your screen. To earn CPE for today's webinar, please make sure you answer all the polling questions. Make sure you click the submit button to submit your answers. Instructors will try to remind you of this as each poll appears. We will be distributing CPE certificates via email in the coming weeks. The instructors and I will answer questions in the question and answer pod. We will try to answer them throughout the webinar. That's all for the housekeeping announcements, and I will turn it over to Patricia.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again to our last session for the day, Fostering Equity in Not-for-Profits. My name is Patricia Pryor, and I'm an audit director serving in Cherry Bekaert's not-for-profit practice. And this afternoon, I have the great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Ms. Janine Brown. Janine is the managing director and owner of Everyday Lead, a talent and diversity consultancy firm. She is a published author, contributor on various thought leadership pieces, a content designer. She travels extensively, attending conferences and serving as keynote speaker, speaking on leadership and inclusion issues all across the US. She works very closely with her clients to help deliver solutions that serve to assist them in increasing attention, attracting new talent, and creating competitive advantages to the power of inclusion. Janine has also held various leadership and consultative roles in state and local taxation and government, in public accounting at Deloitte, and in industry. We are very pleased this afternoon to have Janine as our speaker on such a relevant and timely topic. Welcome, Janine.
Well, thank you, Patricia, for such a thorough introduction. It is my pleasure to be here with you and with all the partners and the associates at Cherry Bekaert and your clients. And I'm really excited about today's topic and just honored to be here to talk about fostering equity in not-for-profits. And I know that we have so many different types of not-for-profits participating today, so this should be a great conversation. We might not be able to go deep into some of the things that your specific organization is facing, but I think we'll leave today with some good questions to ask for you to go back and look at, and some great conversations that we're going to have today. So we're going to have some poll questions, and then after those poll questions, I love engagement, even in a virtual environment. So if you can open up your question window as well, I may ask you to share some thoughts inside the question window. So let's get on into this. So again, I am Janine Brown, and it is a joy to do this work. So I get an opportunity to help organizations across the country design strategies for diversity and inclusion for both on the for-profit side, so what they're doing for-profit, and on the nonprofit side. And I do have a few nonprofit corporate companies that I do work with in organizations. And in those strategy designs, we are often the outsourced organization that companies use. We also do executive coaching, one-on-one, and this is all in the leadership space, and some group coaching and design workplace seminars that respond to leadership development within your organizations. And those can be gender or race and culturally based learning, as well as the normal unconscious bias, conscious inclusion workshops. But today we're going to talk about the diversity, equity, and inclusion maturity model. We're going to look at your nonprofits through the lens of race equity. So today we're going to be very specific, talking about race and looking through the equity lens from that standpoint. And then how can you as an individual, even in the finance space, go back and champion equity in the work that you do and be a positive voice in this particular space. So let's talk about what is DE&I. And most of us know the definitions, but we really don't always know where our organizations are on what I call the maturity journey. So when we look at, what are companies doing, what are organizations doing around diversity, equity, inclusion, creating workplaces of belonging, ensuring that there's equal access both to enter the organization from a talent pipeline, but also the services that we're providing to our constituents. And so I have these 5 areas that I think I want you all to kind of join me in seeing, okay, where is my organization? And so the first one is undeveloped. So we've done nothing. Those are the organizations that we kind of talk about it, but we really done very little in this space. We're not looking at organizational goals. We're not looking at the impact, and the effectiveness is not being measured. But we might have done some things like acknowledge Women Equity Pay Month or International Women's Day. We might do something in February for Black History Month, some of the low-hanging fruit. We might be doing some of those things, but we don't have a strategy. We're not really talking about it much, and we haven't implemented anything internally. So we're undeveloped. Some of us might be at the beginning stages. We know that there are some efforts that are being made around DE&I, and we've made some public relation efforts, right? Even this summer, we saw a number of companies write, public statements against racism or anti-racist statements to support what was happening in the US, and we'll talk about that a little in the upcoming slides. But that's kind of where we are. We're doing some things. We might even have certain programs. We might have some business resource groups that we put together. But one thing that we're not doing is measuring anything. So this is all about our talent in the beginning stages, because we want to be a great place for people to want to work. Then we could be at the intermediate stage. And this is where you're starting to become very focused on certain and several different DEI initiatives. They've been deployed, but they're not really being measured, right? We're not doing any key performance indicators to say, well, have we moved along in being more progressive, and have our programs been more impactful over the last year? We might not even be doing employee engagement surveys that ask questions about experiences that employees are having, but we are doing something. Those organizations that are advanced, they are doing great, robust programs. They are a great place to work. They are doing employee surveys. They're looking at how people are being effective across diverse groups, be it gender or race, or even other groups. But we're looking at it, right? We're looking at it and we're measuring it. And we have specific and annual goals, right? We've said that we are going to put a stake in the ground, and these are the numbers that we're looking at, and we want to see ourselves there. And then a lot of companies haven't gotten to step 5. They're not accelerated, but that is what I would say the perfect organization, right? They're doing all sorts of things related to programming, strategic planning. They're measuring, they're tracking, they're looking at the analytics, and most importantly, they're doing succession planning. So they're looking at who can fill spots, and they're being very strategic. So these are what I would call our maturity journey. And this is an opportunity for you to tell me where you are. So our first poll question, we're going to launch that first poll. And that question is just for you to give me some insight, and everybody on the call, because I think this is sometimes lets us know where everyone is. So our first, where is your organization on the DEI maturity journey that I just walked through? We're undeveloped, we're at the beginning stages, we're in the intermediate space, we're doing some great programs, haven't really started measuring things. We're advanced, or we're accelerated. So you can go ahead and respond. Thank you for responding. Wow, we're almost at 95%. I love participation, especially when I can't see all of you and I can't touch you. All right, we're doing really good here. Doing really good here. Oh, this should be a great conversation, because the numbers are looking really hopeful, right, in this space, and we're going to continue to vet this out some. So what we see, oh, I think I lost the results. Am I frozen? Oh, there we go. Here we are. So the results are really good at the intermediate space, right? So a lot of your organizations, your 38% of you responded that you're intermediate, you're doing programs, might not be in the succession planning yet, might not necessarily be measuring everything or reporting that out, but I think that's really good. And then 31% of you are at the beginning stages. So you're having conversations, you know that you want to be impactful, and you're starting to put things together, and this is great. And so for the rest of you, the undeveloped, I would like to know what's going on. Why aren't we talking about that yet? And there's still this great opportunity to get involved. And so I hope after today that you will kind of go back to your organizations and find out what is going on and how you can do more. And then those of you who are advanced and accelerated, these are the folks who can lead the way, right? You've learned some lessons, you see what works, what doesn't work, and you're those organizations that are actually publishing stuff, I'm sure, and are engaged. And so I would look at those folks who are at accelerated and advanced. That means there's a whole lot of folks who are leading the way in this space. All right. So let's move forward, and somehow I've lost my mouse. Let's see. All right. Oh, here we go. All right. Sorry about that. So like I said at the beginning, we are going to be talking specifically around race equity. And we were, hit in the face with this summer, right? It was a double whammy, right? We came home due to COVID-19 and those protocols that shut down our country. And then in the midst of that, right when we started looking forward to warmer weather in the summer and hopeful, we had a huge event that impacted how we look at race. There was no place we could go, nothing we could watch or talk about that didn't impact race. And so a lot of our organizations were directly impacted because of who we serve in this space, both in the university space and social services, foundations who give grants to organizations that support, in particular, the Black community. And so we knew that there was something that we had to do. And we couldn't hide from the conversations related to the inequities in the US this year. And if you didn't know, you learned a lot, right? We were all made aware of what was happening, and also we're all faced with both our as individuals and with people groups, and made aware of both inequities and our own privileges, right? Because all of our groups have experienced privilege as it pertains to race and racism in the world. And it's not an easy thing to talk about, but we have to, because in the services that a lot of your nonprofits provide, you are going to touch some of these areas, be it religious, be it educational. And so one of the things that I find is in doing this work and trying to bring a lens to equity, even organizations who are providing services to underrepresented or low income or race related entities and communities, still have a hard time talking about racism, right? So we got another polling question. We're going to launch our second polling question. And this is something we all deal with. And I think a lot of it is because we're not fully equipped, right, on how to talk about race. But in order to provide a lens of equity, we got to be able to have some conversations. So where do you fall? Would you rather not talk about race or racism? Or are you uncomfortable, sometimes uncomfortable, usually comfortable, or very comfortable? All right, so we're getting really close to 90%. And hopefully I won't hide myself again. All right, we're looking really good. So we're at 93%. So let's look at our results. The poll is now closed. And maybe I can see the results here. Okay, I don't see the results.
So Janine, I can share them with you that we had 3% said they'd rather not talk about race and racism. 13% said I'm usually uncomfortable talking about race and racism. Then 38% are sometimes comfortable, uncomfortable. 37 are usually uncomfortable, and 10 are very comfortable.
Wow, the numbers are high in the sometimes uncomfortable and the usually comfortable, right? We're looking almost tied here. And I wonder, and I had a follow-up chat question, what makes the discomfort for you? And we won't be able to share that in conversation unless you drop that in the question window. But we find a lot of that is because of all the unknowns, right? And the not wanting to be made wrong or say the wrong thing, where we find this significant amount of discomfort and uncomfort. Kudos to all of you who are very comfortable with this. And I know for those of you who'd rather not, a lot of that comes from past experiences. Because there are days where I don't want to talk about race and racism. And you don't want to offend anyone. Thank you, Caitlin and Lauren, because that is the big part of that, right? You don't want to be offended or be offensive, right? So it's a two-way thing. Some people don't want to talk about it because they don't know what to say, right? They're unsure of what is the core issue. And oftentimes communication is such a challenge that we're not listening. But in the work that you do or that your organizations do, we have to talk about it. Because if we don't understand the barriers, both historic and current, a neighborhood faces on a daily basis, it's difficult to serve those neighborhoods effectively. And I think most of us can agree to that. If I don't know what my clients are facing or how to best serve them from their viewpoint, right? Not from my viewpoint. What do they actually experience day to day? Then how can I provide those services? Oftentimes, I may go into communities, and I've seen this a lot with some of my clients. They have gone into communities to be problem solvers, and they have all the answers, and they fail to sit with those people in those communities and really find out what the core is. And this summer, I had an opportunity to do a lot of work with corporate foundations. And that's one of the things that we spent the time really going back, asking people, are the services that we're providing really what you need based on what's going on in the community? You might be in a food desert, but what sort of foods do you need? Is it not just the food? Is it education on how to cook these foods, right? That's the other piece of that. So when we think about, the lens of equity, I want us to be really clear that we're not talking about equality, right? I think that was one of the things, and this is Janine's opinion, but you'll also read this from other scholars that, the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965 was focused completely on equality, give everyone the same thing. But when you're at a disadvantage, when you're starting years behind, you live in a community, and even now, we look at equity and equality now in the school systems, with schools being shut down. My niece teaches at a Title I school. The equality was, we're going to give everybody an iPad. Equity was, we actually got to train their parents, and we have to train the students on how to use this, and also provide them and identify, do they have the tools at home to troubleshoot, to use this technology? And so that's the difference there. And that's what we want to focus on. An equity framework is a proactive, strategic approach to improving outcomes that account for structural differences in opportunities, burdens, and needs in order to advance targeted solutions that fulfill the promise of true equality for all. So the equity lens is looking at, where are you and how can we help you get to an even playing ground, but not by just giving you the same things that others have. And so race equity, right? When we have solved this problem, the conditions where one's race and identity has no influence on how one fares in society, that's when we know we've achieved race equity, right? In education, closings of schools and impacting, unreliable technology. If the school closes, we know that all students can be successful, right? If we have to do this again. In health, we know that the impact of COVID-19 on certain communities will not be much higher than others because of the access to healthcare, or maybe because of the professions that they're in. In business, in grant making, when we look at payroll, this is how we say, you know, if race equity is achieved, everyone, regardless of race and ethnicity in this country, we know that they can be successful. So also another, you know, I just want to go one last deep dive into the equity lens and just look at these two definitions. You know, an equity framework is a proactive strategic approach, like I said before, to improving the outcomes that accounts for structural differences in opportunities, right? So what are the burdens of the community with the problems we're trying to solve, and the needs in order to advance targeted solutions that fulfill the promise of true equality for all. And then how do we achieve that, right? When no one no longer can predict an advantage, right? Because oftentimes there are conversations about predicting, and we see that, especially in the justice system, right? Jails being built years before they are needed and built to pipeline certain communities from fourth grade, right? The determinations of those things would go away. So the goal of equity from a funding standpoint, from a service provider, when we look at funders that look at philanthropy as a way to solve problems, and that's what we want to do, rather than providing funds to support people facing these problems. So our goal is we're here to solve these problems. And that's what we want to focus on. It teaches a person to fish rather than fishing for them. And we want to be able to do that because that creates sustainable change. If we can help through our organizations, be it education, religion, our foundational work, we can create this sustainable change for organizations. But what are these barriers to equity, especially in the not-for-profit area? They're very similar to what we see in other organizations, but the first one is the systemic and structural issues in the process. So if we're looking at grant making, oftentimes funders are often limited by their own rules and regulations and definitions. So if I say that our grant making is going to go to organizations that can demonstrate financial success and stability, they've been in operation for a minimum of 10 years, that's a barrier to an organization that's a grassroots organization that's making significant change, that's on the ground, understanding exactly what's happening in their communities, but they've only been around for 2 years. They're being run by a brother-sister team or mother-daughter team locally. They're not as established, right? So, you know, using the past to predict the future of success could be a barrier, right? These rules that we have in place. Also, reporting requirements. We have small, already stretched organizations who are serving the communities, but there's reporting requirements that you have from when you are a grantor, you're giving funds that maybe they just don't have time to fill out. They don't have anyone to manage all the details of the grant requirements, and so that could also be a barrier for them if they're not joined in partnership. So how to solve this particular barriers, maybe we need to figure out what can we do internally to support some dynamic grassroots organizations who might fall outside of some of the rules of success that we have in place. You know, the second one is there are no or little experience of the applicant. This kind of ties back to the other one. Like, I think that's where we run into some of our grassroots organizations really struggling for support because they don't have some of the expertise or the experience that some established organizations are, but that is not a definition, or it does not equate to not being effective. And then the usual suspects, right? The same funding goes to the same trusted pools of applicants year after year, which is not a bad thing. That is not an indictment. Because I do believe in excellence and consistency, right? Organizations that are doing the same thing. But if we're only giving to those pools, if we don't create avenues for other organizations that are new to us, new to our committees, then that's a barrier to equity in our space. And we can also look at this, even if you're in higher ed, the same sorts of things, right? How do we get students who may need to come, that would love to come to our universities, but they don't meet some of the requirements, right? They're very bright, they do well, but maybe their GPAs are not as high. And is there a program to get them on campus, help them develop the equity piece, right? Help them get to where they need to go, then pipeline them through your educational pipeline, through the curriculum, so that they're ready. Other barriers is the talent pipeline. So now let's look at who works for you, right? Who works in the organization and where do they come from, right? So we know that a large percentage of philanthropic positions are not held by underrepresented groups. It is very low. And there's a barrier to entry. If we're looking for past experience, if we're looking for education, why aren't there more incentives to get people of color, get Black people to move into these roles, and through the pipeline to leadership? And then it's our own power and privilege, right? I sit on a couple of boards in Atlanta, grant making foundations, actually at my alma mater, as well as local boards where I'm asking for funds on behalf of the board that I sit on. And one of the things I notice is that there's this tug of war between power and privilege, right? There's little public oversight and not accountability to any other constituency. So we kind of operate in a bubble. And then if something doesn't work, what happens, right? Invisible culture and privilege inform how foundations decide what is normal, what's good, what's effective, and what's risky. So we're putting together ourselves what success looks like, and we're not actually, there's no oversight, like in some other professions, where in the accounting profession, there's an oversight committee that tells you what looks right, what's normal, what's acceptable. But oftentimes in what we do, we don't see that. And then we're protected, right? Because we judge what's successful, right? The grantees and the communities are more likely to be judged on their failures, and not what they do well, right? You didn't meet all the requirements of the grant making process, but we don't get a chance to go deeper and say, well, what were they really effective in? And so these are some of the other barriers that come up. Now we're going to actually look at processes that you might oversee after we've talked about, right, these are some of the barriers. Now I want to show you how it shows up. But we're going to do a polling question really quickly. So this is our third of our 4 polling questions for today. Does your organization review its internal processes to identify areas where race equity can be applied? So this is a short one. Yes, no, or I don't know. Ooh, the number's high for yes. This looks good. So I'm really interested in all of you sharing in the group when we go through specific processes within the internal organization of what this looks like at your organization. So this is our opportunity to share a little bit more. Well, thank you for participating in the poll. We got about 40 more seconds, but we're looking pretty good. That 57% of you are saying that your processes are being evaluated, and you're looking at race within those processes. So I'm going to determine if you're right or wrong, if you share. And then 29% of you say you don't know. So this is a great opportunity, again, to go back to your organizations and ask these questions, like, how are we looking at equity, and even race equity? It could be gender equity. What is our lens of equity on our processes? And then 15% of you say no, which is another great way for us to talk about what that looks like. So let's go ahead and look at some different places in the financials. So let's talk about financial statements. So who are the decision makers in your organization and what do they look like, right? This starts with the board of directors. This year, I used to be on staff at Georgia State University, and I was invited to a discussion, and this is not to put GSU on, I don't want to blast them out, especially if there are people from GSU on this call, but this is actually a positive comment. And it's been written about in the paper, right? GSU is starting to graduate the largest numbers of Black men in the state of Georgia, right? A couple of years, they've exceeded even the numbers of men who've graduated from Morehouse College. But when you look at the decision makers at the university, both from the board to the deans and the leadership, there's been this conversation about, well, who's in leadership here? And Georgia State has a lot of internal talent programs. They have women leadership programs, but we also don't see a lot of women in larger leadership roles. And so the first thing when we look at who's making the decisions, how do we apply a race equity lens to this? And how does it impact decisions made on that population? So like in my example for Georgia State, very diverse school, largest university in Georgia right now. And it's extremely diverse. But if students are feeling as if there's not enough diverse representation in leadership or in the classroom, then this is where we start to say, where are these decision makers? Because we know that they're out there. How do we recruit them to our university? Pay equity. The stories are there. A lot of times in nonprofits, there's this merit system. We can publish and see where people fall on the salary range. But one of the things that the race equity lens can bring to pay equity is specific incentives to attract populations that are missing in the talent pipeline. So organizations looking at, well, we want to bring people in, but the barrier is, how do we get talented people to leave for-profit organizations where they might be higher or highly compensated to get them to come over into our organizations before they're working on their second career post-retirement from a for-profit. And so this is an opportunity to bring incentives. And so, which is a great way to kind of shine a light on the equity lens there. Vendor selection, being very specific. What are the percentages of vendors we're looking at? We want to raise that number. So this is where the accelerated, the advanced is in our DEI journey is we want to be really specific about how putting percentages down, being very goal focused on, in order for us to create and eliminate barriers of organizations doing business with us. We're going to say that, 20% of our vendors, 40% of our vendors must be people of color, must be, it could be aligned with race, right? So we do a significant amount of printing. We publish a lot of documents. We should be looking at vendors who also do graphic design work and who also are printers that can come and also support us in this work. So looking at your vendors, and those of you who are, if you're managing finances, you see all of this every day. Investment portfolios. Are you using smaller Black-owned or minority-owned investment advisors to support the work that you do, right? Excuse me. And some organizations are required, right? If you get federal funding, there might be a requirement to do that. But if you don't, this is another opportunity to kind of eliminate the barrier with very talented investment planning and advisors to kind of also help you with this work. I saw this a lot when I worked at Deloitte. We would partner with smaller CPA firms, Black CPA firms, to do some of the work on some of our large engagements. I saw it more on the audit side than in tax, and I was a tax practitioner. But that was one of the ways to kind of do that too, when we look at like how can we help other organizations, other companies, and eliminate those barriers for them to work on projects and work for organizations that they may get overlooked for. Uh-oh. I'm going backwards. Sorry about that, everyone. And then our giving process. I talked about this a little bit earlier when I talked about some of our the barriers is, looking at organizations that might not be as established, They might not be our usual suspects that have large infrastructure to support the work they do, but there could be some grassroots organizations that are doing some dynamic things. And one of the things I helped one of my clients do was it required some additional work hours, some FTEs, but to have funds specifically for these grassroots organizations, but also letting those grassroots organization leadership be a part of the giving process, right? There are ways to kind of continue to do this so that it's equitable and it's fair, but also gives you a look and a lens into other ways to support communities, support organizations. And then DEI programs. So this could be your internal pipeline programs. How do you keep people there? How do you keep them engaged? How are we training our decision makers? How are we creating leaders in the organizations who are bold and champions and allies related to race equity in our financials? And looking at, even in the finance department, like what other things could we be doing so that we are made aware, so that we can support the operations and constantly bringing to their attention and asking these sorts of questions of how does diversity, equity, inclusion fit into these programs and in our spending. And then finally, training. None of this can be accomplished without specific training, without us having conversations about race, about racism, about barriers to entry, about how what we provide to the community, is it going broad enough? Is it impacting the people that we want? Are we solving problems and not just servicing people? And so in the chat window, I know some of you said that your organizations are already doing this, right? 57% of you said you're already looking at your processes. Are there any processes that I didn't mention, or anything that you've seen in your organization that you think has worked really well? I would love to have you share that in the chat window, in the question window. I think we have a few things. Let's see if I can read any of them. I'm not confident that feedback request is really, oh, we're talking about race, to condemn and process. And I agree with that, Brenda. We are very quick to condemn. Oh, policy reviews. Thank you, Heather. So looking at policy reviews, and you're right. So going deep in our policies is a great way, and the procedures, right? How do we do what we do, and why were those policies set up? And I think having a regular schedule of reviewing those policies, because one, we know that technology gives us access to more people. What we've learned even in this this time and this year, being working from home remotely, is that some of our policies needed to catch up to where we are now and what the work of the future is, and how do we reach people when we can't get together. So thank you, Heather, for sharing that. And then making sure a seat on your board is filled with a representative. Rebecca, you're 100% right. Excuse me. Excuse me. And that again is, we hate to use words like quota, but we have to set goals, because if we don't set goals, then we're not measuring anything, and we don't know what success would look like. So being very specific, and we're seeing that. I know on LinkedIn, I've seen several announcements about board placements of very qualified, of course, because we're not bringing in unqualified people, but we're seeing more women, more people of color being added to large not-for-profit, adding to large corporate boards, and being advisors in that space. And then Lorna wrote, looking at the makeup of an organization when selecting vendors. So you're doing that, and that's great, because then that gives people access, because we know that most of the vendors that service us are small businesses, they're closely held organizations. And it's a great way to continue to help them build wealth, both for their communities and for their families. So thank you for participating in that. So let's talk about, excuse me, a second process in your organization when we look at implicit racial bias in hiring. So how do we see the equity lens related to this? So if we're in an organization, I mentioned earlier, one of the challenges and the barriers to equity is because the talent that we hire, right? And it's not that they're bad talent. There's nothing wrong with who's hired. But who do we normally attract, and how do we attract this talent, right? So I've worked in organizations where you got incentives for hiring people. So I hired people who were in my network, right? They were similar to me, and that happens all the time. And so, but what we see in some of our processes, and specifically in hiring, if the majority of our staff is white, we're going through a pool and identifying people and recruiting them via our staff networks. One of the things that we know that nonprofit staffs leverage personal and professional networks, which consistently rank most popular, and they work, right? And they're most effective recruitment channels. But what we end up with is a homogeneous applicant pool. And so, and this happens no matter what the organization looks like. I'm just using an example of white majority staff. So if it's all women, we're probably going to get a lot of referrals of other women. But the challenge we have is that it's just how we are set up here in the US. 75% of white Americans have social networks that do not have any non-white presence, right? So they might not even have relationships, may not have had a referral from college or past work experiences of people of different races. And so the implicit bias, that's where that implicit unintended bias comes in, right? We see that we end up elevating more white applicants or in this homogeneous pool. If it was women, all women applicants, but we're looking at race today. So in a control study of job openings, we found that the other piece of this bias is that applicants with white sounding names are 50% more likely to get an interview than those with Black or culturally sounding names. So cultural names, people with cultural names on their resumes ended up being hired 50% less. And this is why a lot of organizations have attempted to go to the blind resume, the blind resume process. So when we look at interviewing bias, it oftentimes can benefit particular groups in this example, right? So if our organization is very homogeneous, we're going to end up with the same people. And so we have to put ways in the equity lens. How do we change that? This goes back to I think what Heather mentioned about policy reviews. These are process reviews. So maybe now we have a diverse interview pool, our candidate interview pool. Maybe we don't have anyone within our organization. We look to our board. Maybe we even look to our constituents, the people who are going to be served. Maybe there's someone who could participate in that interview process. So this is I think this is a low-hanging area for us to look at, but I think it's a very necessary area because it happens in the talent pipeline, then it's happening in the giving pipeline. And then what happens is that these similar views and viewpoints and ideas about particular communities, about your processes, your impact and effectiveness is not broad enough, right? All people are asking the same questions and no one's challenging it with different solutions. So this is our last polling question. How can your organization remove implicit bias in the hiring process? And maybe you've done some of these things. And I know some smaller organizations, this could be a challenge, but I'll get some answers here. And I'm gonna drink some water. And again, I want to thank you all for participating in the polls and being very active in our conversations here. So we're at 90%. We got about 30 seconds left, but these numbers look great, right? So, you know, just like any standardized test, all of the above, we could do this. But I do also see some of you are being really specific right, expanding who we identify as potential candidates. Where do we find them? And I see this a lot, and I have this conversation with universities and colleges. I sit on a university's foundation board. I'm a member of the foundation board. And and that's one of the questions I ask all the time is, where is this other talent? We know that there are, and let's just talk about Black professionals. We know that there are a lot of Black professionals in higher ed. How can we get them at majority schools in some of these leadership roles? And I think that is, and a lot of people make choices based on their desire to be in certain universities, their desires to want to give back. However, I think the equity lens, being exposed to larger universities, and also for students to see these things, is a great way to do that. And then creating a diverse cross-departmental interviewing team, which is a great way to identify different candidates. I was working with a for-profit client, and one of the things that we were looking at gender, and one of the hiring managers, he was like, I never noticed and realized until we had this discussion that we don't have any women on our hiring team. Oh, and we don't even have any people of color on our hiring team. And then their entire department was 90% white men. But they had all of these women in the organization, and it's a banking organization. And so those are the kind of things that we find out, when we start talking about them, they're revealed to us. So let's quickly talk about the impact when bias is in the process. There's a lack of knowledge about community served. So sometimes we think we have an understanding of who we're serving, but as all sorts of things are coming up. Like, there are communities we thought we knew we were serving, we were meeting their needs, we knew what their needs were, and COVID-19 changed all of that. The wrong decision makers are sometimes at the table because of our limited knowledge and views. And I've been at the table before and said, I don't think I have enough information to be a valuable contributor to this. And I think this is where our own honesty has to come into play, because sometimes we do have limited viewpoints and important considerations are missed because of that lack of information. Sometimes we're measuring the wrong things. And I see this oftentimes in employee engagement surveys. I could be working for your organization. I love what I do. So my engagement on the engagement survey, I might have very high scores. But if I'm only looking at quantitative information, and I'm not having subjective conversations to get the real story. So I might love what I do. My personal willpower and resilience is keeping me here because I'm working for someone who's constantly dropping microaggressions and micro assaults, but I love what I do. And so what you see on the survey is, I love what I do, but you never pick up, I hate the culture or the environment or the manager that I'm working with. And that happens all the time. And then we have value misalignment. What's important, and this often happens in the middle of the organization. The folks at the grassroots levels of your organizations out there doing the work, they are very clear about what they want to do. They're looking at their own biases. They're checking biases in the process. The leadership from the board is having these conversations. They want to do it, but it's those of us in the middle who are executing because we're focused on getting the work done. And sometimes those same values are not misaligned. And so the time it takes to identify people who are not in our organization, the pipeline, it takes a long time when I can say, hey, I know someone, we're going to bring them in. And so those are the misalignments. So how do we take action here? Does it make sense for your D&I committees to be inward facing or outward facing, or a combination of both? And I will say both. Taking action is, we're going to always look at ourselves. We're going to look in the mirror and not just out the window. We don't want to just be hopeful about how we can solve problems in our communities, how we can solve problems for our constituents and our members. We want to solve problems both starting with ourselves so that we are a reflection of the communities that we want to create. Also asking this question, how will your not-for-profit assess the progress you are making towards your goals of diversity, inclusion, and equity? You have to measure them, right? Just like you measure everything else, we have to measure our progress and we have to report it out. This is where transparency comes in. It's just like if we want to reach more people, if we want to increase our numbers of freshmen this year, we measure what that looks like. We set specific goals. We target specific students and schools. We start to advertise. We tell our recruiters what their goals are, and we hold them accountable to them. And that's the same thing in this space. And then we have to talk about, what does success really look like? And what does it feel like when we've gotten there? And then we have to have transparent goals. And I know we're getting really close to our time, but taking action about transparency is very important. Share this and the steps that you're taking. So even from a finance standpoint, share it. Hey, we're going to start looking at all of our vendors. How long have we been doing business with them? Are there new vendors in the marketplace that we should be working with? And talking about that and encouraging others in the organization to do the same thing. We're going to set both quantitative goals, and we're going to measure them, and we're going to publish them, and not publish them only under pressure. We're going to have an opportunity to make that part of our communication with our constituents and our students and our employees, so both internally and externally. And then what do we expect in collaborating with the community? I think this is a great way for us to say, we want our community partners. If we're funding your efforts, or if you want us to fund your efforts, we want to make sure we have similar values and goals. So if we're giving foundation dollars to an organization, are we aligned in what we believe is important around equity? And that's over and above what the program. Are they doing the same practices, right? Are they looking at their vendors? Do they have goals about who's going to sit on their boards, right? There has to be this reciprocity around this, because that's the only way we go from, 15% of us not even looking at equity, where 45% of us are. And then finally, diverse leadership and engagement. And we saw this in some of the questions. We got to be really specific and start recruiting board members and staff, and creating a pipeline where underrepresented groups and individuals will start to want to come into our organizations and into not-for-profits and do this very important and valuable work. And understanding what those cultures are like, and that people have very successful careers there, and removing those barriers. And some of those barriers, I did some work with Northwestern Mutual in Wisconsin, and their foundation, they're actually even looking at how do we remove the barriers around four-year college degrees, right? Can we bring people into our organizations, especially in the technology space, where a certification and experience is equivalent to a four-year degree in technology? And so how can we apply some similar thinking in bringing people into our organization? Should we be hiring people in our specific communities? Should our organization look like the people we serve? And then is the organization's commitment to diversity, inclusion, and equity part of an orientation message for new board members, when you're incorporating onboarding, for new teammates, and also for your volunteers, right? So we believe in this. We know that this is important, and we're going to ensure that everybody hears the same message all the time around this. And so this is another great way to take action. And when you, especially in accounting and finance, right, we say, look, we're looking at things from an equity lens. So when you're looking for problems, when you're looking to bring solutions to the table, we're all going to do that. And then finally, does your nonprofit create opportunity to listen to the voices directly from the community? And I think this is where real change really starts to happen, is impactful, is when we bring people in that we're serving and really listen to what their needs are, and how can we have conversations with them so that we can continue to enhance the services and the programs that we're providing, and that we're offering, to make sure that any blind spots we have, any gaps in what they need is being met. And so that concludes my presentation. If there are any questions, I can take those. I don't know if we had any that came through that I did not see. I see Patty had a comment. Her organization had a very bad habit of hiring people they know, and when the workforce is mostly white, that perpetuates hiring inequities. Yes, it's a proven, right? Your organization's proved it. It's been a proven story. Thank you so much, Samuel, for the kudos. I enjoyed talking about this. And also, and I can't see the first name, but the last name is Sistrom. Thank you so much for the comments, and I'm glad you enjoyed the presentation. I am reachable anytime, and I want to thank the team at Cherry Beckert again for having me. And it's just been a joy to have this conversation. I know we couldn't go deep, but I do hope that there were some things that stood out for you to consider and to take back. And again, I'd be happy to have a conversation. And then I just want to end up with Nelson Mandela. I thought this was a great quote, especially when we think about talking about race or talking about problem solving. If you talk to a woman or a man in a language that he or she understands, that goes to their head. If we talk to a man or a woman in his or her own language, it goes to his heart. And so we want to make sure that we're having heart conversations around this work, and that we are solving problems and meeting people where they are. And so that's what I want to conclude with, because I think that's where we get to solving more solutions. Oh, I see a couple of more questions, and I'll read those. I hope not-for-profits will shift to recruiting efforts. Having been in not-for-profit for a long time, the goal in recruiting board of directors is mainly their financial ability to raise funds. That is so true. I have been asked to sit on boards all the time. One, to be the treasurer, and I keep telling people I don't practice anymore. And two, to do fundraising. And that, because it's a huge need. And I've raised a lot of funds from corporate giving. And so you're right. And so it does end up boxing people out. I sit on a startup school, and right now, that's my question. I was like, you guys, we need some people who have relationships in the city of Atlanta and who can get us funding. And that does tend to box people out of service. How do you get state government to implement equity policies? You know what, it's very interesting, and it is it's kind of tough. Especially depending on where those state entities are, right? So, because we want to get a qualified pool, oftentimes people didn't want to relocate. I hope that this year is going to actually widen the opportunities for hiring, because we've already proven that we don't actually have to be in the same office at the same time in the same city doing this work. And so I'm hoping, Gwen, that this is an opportunity for organizations, including state government, to say there's some candidates that we could actually reach out to that could work remotely, and they're becoming part of the workplace of the future as well, because that's the only way it's going to happen. And I think a lot of organizations are, and I think it's really going to be a policy shift. It has to be, but I do think if we're looking at talent pipeline, this is the year to have those conversations. Do people actually have to be here? I could actually be in DC and work for the Alabama Department of Revenue. I don't know. There might be some limitations on policies, but I think there's a great way to do that. Karen, thank you for the feedback, and Jill, also thank you for the feedback. I'm going to turn this back over to Matthew to close us out. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Jean. Really appreciate your expertise and your insights here, and just helping a lot of those who are at the lower end of the maturity process have a few ideas for places to begin. So thank you again. As we wrap up for today, I just want to say I appreciate everybody being in the virtual seminar so far. This wraps up day one. We will be back for 4 more sessions on Tuesday, December 15th, with the same agenda starting at 10 a.m. Eastern time and wrapping up at the same time. So we look forward to having those of you who are looking forward to more CPE back next Tuesday. So everyone have a great rest of the day and a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you all.